Our narrow gauge odyssey in films, made over a period of some 40 years, begins appropriately enough in that part of the country which was the cradle of the narrow gauge, North Wales. These views of the Snowdon Mountain Railway, filmed as long ago as 1931, show the original style of semi-open coaches built for the start of the line in April 1896. The 4 3/4 mile long Rat Railway runs from Llanberis to the summit of the highest mountain in England and Wales. Its terminus at Snowdon Summit is some 3,500 feet above sea level. The semi-open coaches had all been converted to more modern and comfortable closed vehicles by 1957. All the steam locomotives on the line were built by the Swiss Locomotive and Machine Company. Number 2 Enid, seen here, was one of 5 supplied for the opening of the line. Leaving Llanberis, the train begins the long climb to the summit. The engine is not coupled to the coach. The wisdom of this arrangement was demonstrated on the opening day in 1896, when locomotive number 1, Ladas, became derailed and plunged down the mountainside to meet a premature end. Had it been coupled to the carriage, that and its passengers would have followed the locomotive to oblivion. The line was built to the rack system designed by the Swiss engineer Dr. Roman Abt. Its gauge is 2 foot 7.5 inches or 800 millimeters. Cogged wheels under the locomotive grip the center rack rails to provide the necessary adhesion when climbing and brake power when descending. This loop is 1 1/4 miles from Llanberis and 1,156 feet above sea level. The engine takes water at the loop at halfway, 2.5 miles up and 1,600 feet above sea level. As often happens on the occasion when Bruce Jenkins visited the Snowdon Mountain Railway in the early 1960s, there was cloud cover and limited visibility on the upper reaches of the line. Heading down from the summit, the first passing place is at Clogwyn, 2,153 feet above sea level. Visibility has improved somewhat by halfway. Here, an outbound train will halt to take water. The only non-passenger workings on the railway are those for maintenance purposes and to bring supplies to the station at the summit. Up until its complete closure in 1965, there was another fascinating narrow-gauge system on the opposite shore of Llyn Padan from Llanberis. This served the slate quarries at Dinorwig. The slate industry in North Wales in the last century was the driving force behind several of the narrow-gauge railways which we will explore in this programme. The vast slate quarries at Dinorwig covered at their peak about 700 acres. Slate was quarried at different levels or galleries, each of which had its own railway. Sybil, seen here, built in 1906 by Bagnalls, was the only one of the over 20 1-foot 10 3/4-inch gauge locos used at Dinorwig not built by Hunslet. Some idea as to the size of the quarries can be gained as Keith Christie pans his camera, showing also the railway tracks on the different levels in the quarry. Workers demonstrate the delicate art of cutting and dressing a block of slate, with skilled taps in just the right places to achieve the desired effect. Once the slate had reached ground level, another unusual railway system was employed to take it to the coast for onward shipment. The Padan Railway does come within the brief of this programme, as its gauge was 4 foot, a good bit less than the British standard gauge of 4 foot 8.5 inches. Narrow gauge wagons laden with slate were pushed onto transporter wagons on the 4-foot gauge tracks at the quarries and hauled most of the way to Port Dinorwig on the Menai Straits. For the last leg of their journey from the other end of the 4-foot gauge tracks, the narrow gauge wagons were lowered down an incline to the port. This 4-foot gauge 060 tank, built by Hunslet in 1886, is seen shunting wagons laden with narrow gauge slate trucks at Llanberis. The Corris Railway was opened in 1859 to convey slate from quarries at Aberclefeni and Corris down to a wharf on the River Dyfi near Machynlleth. It was built to a gauge of 2 foot 3 inches. The line was eventually taken over by the Great Western Railway, and the last train ran in 1948. These scenes were recorded at Moyspoeth Junction, where a branch had diverged from the main line to serve the Upper Corris quarries. The last part of the line to see traffic was that from Aberclefeni to Ratgoed, where an inclined plane was used to bring wagons laden with blocks of slate out of a quarry. When a wagon reached the bottom of the incline, horsepower was used to move it on. This is the disused station at Corris, filmed in 1952. More tangible reminders of the railway still exist in the form of two of its locomotives, put to work on the Talyllyn Railway when this line closed. The Festiniog Railway, built to a gauge of 1 foot 11.5 inches, opened in 1836 and became the first narrow-gauge railway in Britain to use steam locomotives in 1863. This rare clip shows the Festiniog in action in the 1930s. The line closed in 1946 with the decline of the slate traffic, which was its raison d'etre, and fell into disuse. This was the state of the railway as the preservationists began their struggle to save it in the early 1950s. The tracks were overgrown as works parties set out to restore the line. These scenes, filmed by Keith Christie in 1953, show a simplex locomotive of World War I vintage arriving at Mean Forth. Prince, dating from 1863, a stalwart in those early days, is seen here with the double Fairley locomotive Talyllyn in grey works primer. The restoration of this machine to working order was still some years away. Boston Lodge Works was more than a little derelict. Number 2 Prince and sister locomotive number 1 Princess were the first narrow-gauge steam locomotives to run in Britain. In 1955, services were operated across the Cobb to Boston Lodge, but an extended section of track was ready for trains by the following year. Prince is seen here hauling a train in 1956 on the section between Boston Lodge and Mean Forth. Passenger services returned to Mean Forth from the 19th of May, 1956. Prince brings a train into Mean Forth station. Then as now, carriage doors are kept locked whilst the train is in motion and opened by the guard at stations. The following year, 1957, the line was reopened as far as the next station, Penryn Daydraith. Prince runs round the train at Penryn before heading back to Porthmadog. The line reopened as far as Tanobulk, 7.5 miles from Porthmadog, in April 1958. By this time, the double Fairley locomotive Talyllyn, which dated from 1886, was back in service. When Malcolm Thompson visited the railway in 1962, the enormous changes which have been made since the early days of the preservation era are only too apparent. The line beyond Tanubulk was still derelict, and Festiniog trains were not to reach the next station until 1968. The Festiniog was not the first narrow-gauge railway in Wales to be resurrected by preservationists. The railway preservation movement in Britain was born in the efforts to save the Talyllyn Railway, which is our next port of call. The 2-foot 3-inch gauge Talyllyn Railway opened in 1866 to provide a means of transporting slate from the quarries at Nant Gwernol down to the coast at Tywyn. Despite the final closure of the quarries in 1947, the railway's owner, Sir Henry Hayden Jones, kept the line open for tourist traffic in the summer until his death in 1950. The previous year, a group of enthusiasts had formed the Talyllyn Railway Preservation Society, and this body acquired the line from Sir Hayden's estate. The railway thus never actually closed. The first train under the new regime running on the 14th of May 1951. Keith Christie was involved with the railway in those early pioneering days of its preservation, and his films of the line date from 1953. When the Society took over the line, there was only one working locomotive on the railway. Fortunately, British Railways still had not disposed of 2 locomotives from the Corris. These were brought by the Talyllyn for the sum of £25 each. Delivery of the locomotives to Tywyn by BR actually cost more than the engines themselves. The 2 ex-Corris machines were given the names Sir Hayden and Edward Thomas to honour the line's former owner and his railway manager, and were numbered 3 and 4. The 2 original Talyllyn locomotives, Talyllyn and Dolgorch, had never carried numbers from the time they were built in the 1860s, though they became numbers 1 and 2 when the Society took over the railway. The 2 Corris locos were joined in 1953 by number 6, Douglas, which had been built by Andrew Barclay in 1918 for the Admiralty. Having spent much of its life at RAF Colshot in Hampshire, it was presented to the railway by an industrial concern after whose chairman it was named, by way of thanks. With its immediate motive power needs taken care of, the society set out to repair years of neglect. On a very damp day in the summer of 1953, number 3 Sir Hayden brings a train into Towyn Wharf station. Some clearances on this railway were extremely tight, none more so than that through the bridge at the station, though this would soon be rebuilt. As a consequence of this, one very interesting characteristic of Talyllyn operating practice was that there were doors on only one side of the carriage, and all station platforms thus had to be on the same side of the line. One only has to compare the scene at Towyn today to that in 1953 to get some measure of the progress which has been made over the years. As Sir Hayden runs round the train, it will be observed that there are no doors on the non-platform side. The original carriage stock of the Talyllyn Railway consisted of 4 coaches and a van. Built between 1866 and 1870, these were rather Spartan vehicles with no lighting or heating and, apart from the van, unbraked. Horace Loco number 4, Edward Thomas, brings a train past the Talyllyn Works at Towyn Pendra, half a mile out from Wharf Station, as we travel up the line in those early pioneering days. Looking at the clearances through the bridges, you can see why the Board of Trade was unhappy and welcomed the company's decision to permanently close up the doors on one side. In the era when the Talyllyn was run by Sir Hayden Jones, the railway was worked on the one-engine-in-steam principle, and there was no need for any signalling system. An up train is signalled into the loop at Bringlass on the occasion of the Talyllyn Railway Preservation Society's general meeting, always a busy day on the line. The scheduled service crosses the members' special, which proceeds onwards through Dolgork Station. Before passing the 4th locomotive in steam that day, number 6 Douglas, in Quarry Siding, with a train of former slate wagons. Abergynolwyn was where the train service terminated up to 1976, when the line was extended some 3/4 of a mile up to Nant Gwernol. Beyond Abergynolwyn, the track had been lifted after the quarries had closed. Those intrepid enough to follow the track bed could walk to Nant Gwernol and beyond to see the remains of the inclines and their associated winding gear, which had been used to bring slate wagons up to more than 700 feet above sea level. In normal service in the early years, a couple of coaches and a van were usually adequate to cope with the traffic. The coaching stock, like the locomotives, were not given numbers until the Society took over. Brake van number 5 also doubled as a mobile booking office from which the guard sold tickets to any passengers who wished to join the train at the intermediate stations. A down train arrives at Pendra, hauled by Sir Hayden. The single-line token is thrown to the signalman at the block post. Still at Pendra, the same loco passes the old barn on the north side of the works yard, the resting place for many years of locomotive number 1, Talith Lynn, which was out of use and awaiting repairs from 1946 until 1958. The two Corris locos are seen together at Wharf Station. In this amusing sequence, two boys attempt to coal number 3. These were the halcyon days of railway preservation, with few restrictions on who could attempt what, and not a high visibility vest in sight. Number 6 runs round a train at Towyn, which includes in its formation one of the ex-Penryn Quarry open coaches acquired by the Talith Lynn in 1954. Clearances under the road bridge at the station throat were much improved when it was rebuilt by the local council in 1955. The Talith Lynn works at Towyn Pendra offered quite an impressive collection of buildings for such a modest line. Number 3 brings one of the original pair of locos out of the shed. In our final sequence on the Talith Lynn, made by Keith Christie in 1955, we will take a glimpse at the sort of work which went on all through the 1950s and indeed continues to this day to keep this living museum in good order. In the early years of the preservation era, the Talith Lynn received quite a bit of assistance from the Territorial Army. This group in the Birmingham area had come to do some work on laying telephone cables. Whilst this was going on, Keith Christie was involved as a volunteer in a project to extend the loop at Bringlass. The first part of this work involved removing the point at one end of the existing loop and replacing it with temporary rails. The first train to try out the new track was that bringing the Territorials back down the line. It successfully negotiated the temporary road and was shunted into what was, for the moment at least, a siding. A service train hauled by Edward Thomas is next on the scene. The following day, the main line had to be moved over to make room for the extended loop. This left a rather alarming-looking kink in the track. The first working to try this out was Edward Thomas on a works train. Many eyes anxiously observe the progress of the loco over this less than perfect piece of temporary track before work can begin on installing the new point and the additional track. Our films of the 1-foot, 11.5-inch gauge Vale of Rydal Railway, which runs from Aberystwyth to Devil's Bridge in mid-Wales, were made by Keith Christie in the 50s and 60s. The line opened in 1902 with the dual purposes of serving mines in the upper reaches of the Rydal Valley and taking tourists to see the spectacular scenery and waterfalls in and around Devil's Bridge. A product of the Light Railways Act of 1896, the mineral traffic never amounted to much. Tourists and trippers quickly became its mainstay. Unlike the other railways we have seen to date, this line was run by British Railways. Its independent existence had ended in 1913 when it was taken over by the Cambrian, which in turn was absorbed by the Great Western at the grouping of Britain's railways in 1923. In 1948, the Vale of Rydal became part of the western region of the newly formed BR. Motive power consisted of 3 powerful 262 tanks. The first of these, number 9, Prince of Wales, was built by Davis and Metcalfe in 1902. 2 similar machines were built by the Great Western at Swindon in 1923, number 7, Owain Glendower, and number 8, Llewellyn. In 1924, the original narrow gauge station was closed and Vale of Rydal tracks were extended to the mainline station. The narrow gauge engine shed remained where it was, and this meant empty stock workings between the two were frequent occurrences. The separate narrow gauge engine shed did not close until the end of steam on the Cambrian lines in 1967, when the 3 Rydal locomotives moved into the now redundant BR steam shed at the station. The first 4.5 miles of the line out from Aberystwyth to Capel Bangor follows the course of a river and has no appreciable gradient. The nature of the line changes radically, and the locomotive has to face 7 miles of severe curves and gradients as steep as 1 in 50 on the climbs towards the terminus at Devil's Bridge. Trains could cross at busy times at Aberffrwyd, 7.5 miles from Aberystwyth. The stop here enabled the crews to take water before embarking on the long climb up to Devil's Bridge. And allowed inspectors to grip the passengers' tickets. The final section, with its reverse curves and the track perched on a ledge high above the valley, is as spectacular as any in Britain, with the engine working hard all the way. plate layers join the train, and a real passenger in the form of a schoolboy tries to catch up with it. The train draws into Devil's Bridge and the engine prepares to run round. The locos were painted green as part of that well-documented final flourish of Western region or thinly disguised Great Western independence in the mid-1950s. Carriages began to appear in chocolate and cream livery, both on the main lines and, as can be seen here, on the Vale of Rydal, where the stock on this occasion is painted both in traditional GWR colours and the earlier BR so-called blood and custard. The names bestowed on the two Swindon-built locos at this time was another manifestation of this Western region renaissance. Later that day, a spot of shunting was called for to add an extra coach to the train from one of the sidings at Devil's Bridge. Having completed the shunt, number 8 Llewellyn goes off to take water. In 1960, the railways in this part of Wales were transferred from the Western to the London Midland region, and from August 1968, with the end of steam on the standard gauge, the Vale of Rydal became the only part of the whole network to be worked by steam. In the late 60s, locomotives and coaches were painted all over in BR corporate blue. We probably thought it looked ghastly when it was done, but with the passage of time, it all now looks rather quaint. Sporting this blue livery, complete with the BR double arrow logo, number 7 takes water at Devil's Bridge. From this tranquil scene, we must move on to another BR narrow gauge line in Wales, whose character was very different from that of the Vale of Rydal. This is Welshpool Station in the summer of 1955. The Civil Service Motoring Association has been infiltrated by railway enthusiasts, and for their summer outing a train has been chartered on the 2-foot-6-inch Welshpool and Llanfair line, now a part of the Western region of British Railways. The locomotive is a Bayer Peacock-built 060 tank, number 822, formerly known as the Earl, one of a pair of engines supplied for the opening of the line in 1903. In open wagons, seemingly equipped with seats borrowed from the platforms at Welshpool, the passengers settle down as the train begins its 9-mile journey to Llanfair Caerhenion. For the first mile, the line burrows through the back streets of Welshpool, climbing all the way. Bad news for any washing left out to dry. It finally leaves the town behind at Raven Square, now the site of the terminus of today's Preserve line. Unlike the rest of the Welsh lines we have considered to date, there was no great source of mineral traffic at the other end to drive the promoters on. The line simply linked the small country town of Llanfair with Welshpool. Passenger numbers were modest as befitted a rural branch line. The passenger service was ended by the Great Western as long ago as 1931. Only local goods traffic in coal, livestock and general merchandise was on offer. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the Welshpool and Llanfair was that it survived so long. It was not closed by British Railways until November 1956. The special pauses at the midpoint of the line Castell Caerhenion to allow the civil servants and their guests to stretch their legs. The passengers detrain at Llanfair and the engine goes off to run round and take water. The miraculous survival of this line until 1956, one wonders whether Paddington had forgotten about it, made it almost inevitable that following the example of the Talyllyn and Festiniog, a preservation society should be formed. And so it was. The section of line from Raven Square to Llanfair was saved. The remaining section through the town to the BR station was not really sustainable. The two original locomotives were preserved, and the first 4.5 miles from Llanfair was reopened in 1963. In July 1981, the trains began to run through from Llanfair to a splendid new terminus at Raven Square in Welshpool to complete the restoration of this charming little railway. That was all in the future, as the special heads towards Welshpool across the Banwy Bridge. The standard 1950s enthusiast uniform of hats, macks and berets provides a delightfully nostalgic counterpoint to today's leisure wear. train begins to thread its way back through the town. When the line was built, there was a halt here at 7 Stars, which took its name from a nearby pub. The empty stock of the special heads back towards the station, crossing what was then the main road through Welshpool. Our final footage of the line in BR days was taken by Tim Shuttleworth, who travelled on the last special before it closed to all traffic in November 1956. A brass band provided entertainment at Welshpool Station as the special departs. The crowds have come out, and the bunting has been unfurled to say goodbye to the line. There is another performance from the band at Raven Square. As the train climbs out of Welshpool, it is passed by the bus, carrying those determined musicians who will ambush the special again at Castell Caerenion. Happily, this was not to be the last scherzo for the line, merely a pause, albeit a 7-year-long one, before the next movement. Over the years, much has been published on the 3-foot gauge railways of the Isle of Man. This superb 16mm colour footage filmed by C.J. Barnard in 1952, our first scenes are at Ramsey as number 8 Fenella sets out from the station. Number 16 Mannin, dating from 1926, the last and the largest of the Bayer Peacock 240 tanks used on the Isle of Man, arrives at Port Erin on a train from Douglas, the terminus of the one section of the steam railway still open today. Number 12 Hutchinson will be the engine on the next train back to Douglas from Port Erin. Working what appears to be some sort of fast service, the train does not call at either Santon or Port Sodric on its way to Douglas. St. John's was the junction where the line from Douglas divided to serve Peel and Ramsey. Trains from Douglas from these two destinations often ran in one formation as far as St. John's, where they were divided. The portions for Peel and Ramsey would then leave simultaneously on their separate tracks, providing this spectacle for those watching. Number 6 Peveril leaves St John's with a train for Douglas. Union Mills was the second stop out of Douglas on the line to St John's. This is an inbound train. The locomotive is once again Peveril. The next train is hauled by number 3 Pender, now preserved at the Museum of Science and Industry in the city where she was built, Manchester. We head back to the mainland sailing out of Douglas. If you went due east from Ramsey in the north of the island, you would arrive within spitting distance of our next destination, Ravenglass. The 7-mile-long Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway was opened in 1875 as a 3-foot gauge line to serve iron mines in Eskdale in what is now Cumbria. As the mineral traffic declined, the railway relied on seasonal visitors for its survival. In 1915, it was rebuilt as the 15-inch gauge line, which is still in business today. In its earlier years in this form, some goods and mineral traffic was still carried. However, it is as a tourist line that it found its niche. These scenes were filmed in August 1955 by C.J. Barnard. The trip was made in a well-filled train hauled by 282 tender engine River Esk, dating from 1923. The 15-inch gauge line terminated at Dalgarth. The original mineral railway had continued on to the village of Boot. The locomotive is now turned before it can head back to Ravenglass. The size of the overbridges is a reminder of the line's broader gauge origins. Our next group of railways were located north of the border. British Aluminium's narrow gauge system at Fort William was Scotland's biggest. Loco number 1, Sir Murray Morrison, rebuilt and renamed Dromard, is now at work on the Cavan and Leitrim Railway in Ireland. Number 2, Lady Morrison, was still at work on the line from the factory to the pier on the lock when Jeff Todd and other members of the Glasgow University Railway Society visited the system in May 1957. This 3-foot gauge railway was built to aid the construction of a massive hydroelectric scheme to take the waters of Lochs Treig and Lagan under Ben Nevis to a generating plant at the aluminium factory. There was over 25 miles of track in use. The railway was retained once the construction phase was over to provide access for maintenance in this remote area which had few roads. The curving steel trestle across the Altcurran and Owen, known as the Coor Viaduct, was the most spectacular of the 53 bridges or viaducts on the system. The line was worked by diesel locomotives and rail cars. The Special was hauled by a Rushton diesel built in 1949 and called Lagan Dam. This machine was scrapped in 1961. The building of forestry roads opened up the area and allowed for the closure of the railway in stages between 1972 and 1977. To service another aluminium smelter at Kinlochleven, a 1¼ mile double-track 3-foot gauge railway was opened in 1909. As a large hydroelectric plant was part of the complex, the railway was electrified using a 500 volts DC overhead wire system. 3 locos worked on the line. The line was abandoned and the loco scrapped in the early 1960s. Another intriguing Scottish industrial line was the 4-mile-long 2-foot 6-inch gauge system at Winchborough near Edinburgh, which linked oil shale mines with a processing plant. Opened in 1902, this was Scotland's first electrically worked railway. Wagons loaded with oil shale were taken up an incline and manoeuvred and then unloaded manually into the hoppers below. A workman's service was operated between the processing plant at Niddry Castle and the mines at Duddingston and Totley Wells. The very basic coaches used had a door on one side only, shades of the Talith Linn. Two new electric locos were supplied in 1947 to cope with a post-war surge in demand for oil. These were built by Barclays of Kilmarnock using Metropolitan Vickers electrical equipment. At one point, the line passed under the former North British Railway route from Linlithgow to the Forth Bridge. These scenes were filmed by Jeff Todd in 1960, the year before the whole antiquated Scottish shale oil industry closed down. One of the electric locomotives is preserved at the Armand Valley Heritage Centre in nearby Livingston, and 4 of the 265 wagons used on the system were re-gauged and are used on ballast duties on the Talith Linn. A massive excavator owned by the Parkgate Iron and Steel Company in Leicestershire, England, is a reminder that the quarrying of ironstone was once an important industry in the Midlands. The size of the machine and the depth of the quarry in which it was employed can be gauged by the man standing in front of it. By the end of the 50s, the industry was in decline. This Rushton steam excavator had been abandoned and will not work again. Narrow gauge lines were used in the quarries to transport the ironstone to standard gauge railheads. The system at Eastwell near Melton Mowbray was built to a gauge of 3 foot. The tubs containing the ironstone had to be lowered down this incline to reach the railhead on the former London North Western and Great Northern joint line from Bottisford Junction to Melton Mowbray. Keith Christie shot these scenes at Eastwell in 1960 before its final abandonment. Nancy, an 060 tank built by the Avonside Engine Company in 1908, shunt some empty tubs. The reddish-coloured building in the background housed the winding gear for the incline we saw earlier. This lineup of narrow-gauge locos awaiting their fate includes examples built by Peckett, Hunslet and Bagnall. At the nearby Waltham quarries, the railway system was, unusually for Britain, metre gauge. Nantes was an 060 tank built in Paris in 1903, which came to Britain in 1934. In August 1960, the Birmingham Locomotive Club organised a farewell tour of the Eastwell system. Participants took their places in ironstone tubs. Hardly first-class accommodation, but no doubt great fun. Though today one wonders if rail tour organisers would get away with such stunts. Nancy was the locomotive which hauled the tour that day. This was subsequently preserved and went eventually to Ireland, appropriately to a location in County Antrim, where the first elements of Ireland's extensive 3-foot gauge network were constructed in the 1870s to exploit iron ore deposits in the northeast of that county. The final industrial narrow-gauge railway covered in this programme was in Kent. In the first decade of the 20th century, the firm of Edward Lloyd and Company opened a paper mill at Sittingbourne. A 2-foot 6-inch gauge railway was constructed to link the mill with a wharf at Milton Creek. This proved to be inadequate, so a new dock was built at Riddham on the River Swale, which could accommodate larger ships. This work was begun in 1913, but was not completed because of the First World War until 1919. In the 20s, a new and larger paper mill was constructed at Kemsley between Riddham and Sittingbourne, and the existing railway system expanded to cope with the additional traffic which this generated. A procession of locomotives passes Harry Luff's camera at Riddham. The first of these is Chevalier, an 062 tank built by Manning Wardle and Company in 1915. Next is Superior, another 062 tank, this time built by Kerr Stewart in 1920. Hauling some bogie wagons is 062 tank Conqueror, built by Bagnalls in 1922. At its busiest time in the 1950s, there were 13 steam locomotives on the railway, which was used to carry wood, wood pulp and china clay to the paper mills and bring out rolls of finished newsprint. The railway also provided regular timetable passenger services to take workers around the extensive site. A mixed train conveying passenger carriages, wagons carrying rolls of newsprint and empty wagons is seen here. Because of the environment in which they worked and the potentially incendiary mixture of steam locomotives throwing out sparks and lots of paper and wood sitting around or being conveyed on the trains, spark arresting equipment was essential, and this gave some of the locos a rather colonial appearance. When the line closed for industrial purposes in 1969, a section of it was leased to the Locomotive Club of Great Britain, and this became the Sittingbourne and Kemsley Light Railway. In addition to the locos retained to work on this line, 4 of the Bow Waters locos went to work at the Zoological Gardens at Whipsnade in Bedfordshire. Though it is outside our narrow gauge brief, Bow Waters possessed one other notable machine, which worked the standard gauge exchange sidings with BR. Pioneer 2 was acquired by the company in 1958, when it was withdrawn by British Railways. It was a P-class 060 tank, built for the South Eastern and Chatham Railway in 1910. When withdrawn by Bow Waters, it was preserved on the Bluebell Railway in Sussex, where it can still be seen today. By way of contrast with the industrial railways which we have been exploring, the last part of this programme concentrates on lines which were mainly concerned with pleasure. What was claimed to be the longest pier in the world, some 1¼ miles, was built at Southend in Essex in the 19th century. The first pier was made of wood and had a horse-drawn tram to convey visitors along its length. When this wooden pier was replaced with the present iron structure in 1888, it was decided to build an electric railway. When it opened in August 1890, this 3-foot 6-gauge line was one of the first electric railways to operate anywhere in the world. By 1945, the railway was in need of modernization, and our 1950s films feature the new trains which were delivered from 1949 onwards. 4 trains, each consisting of 7 carriages, were ordered from AC Cars of Thames Ditton. These were finished in a stylish green and cream livery and were technically quite sophisticated for the period, with continuous brakes, electric heating and sliding doors operated by the crew. There were 3 motor cars and 4 trailers in each set. The motor cars seated 34 and the trailers 38. Power for the railway was supplied at 550 volts DC via a conductor rail located between the running rails. These scenes were filmed near the southern end of the line, far out in the Thames estuary. The railway ran from the North Station at the landward end to Pier Head. The route was double-track, with crossovers outside each of the terminal stations. The line was equipped with semi-automatic colour light signalling, controlled from 2 signal boxes, one at each end of the railway. In the first year after the new trains were introduced, a staggering 4,700,000 passengers travelled on the line, though these spectacular numbers had declined to less than 1 million by the beginning of the 70s, when the first of these trains was withdrawn. Following a serious fire on the pier in 1976, the electric railway was abandoned, its track and signalling apparently life expired. After some years of debate as to the future of the pier and its railway, a new diesel-powered line was opened in the 1980s. In the 1920s, the Southern Railway abandoned its branch to Ramsgate Harbour Station, when a new connection was built to enable trains from Broadstairs and Margate to run through the town rather than terminate at the harbour. Some 10 years later, an amusement park on the seafront obtained powers to build a 2-foot gauge electric railway through the abandoned tunnel that had been used by the trains bound for the old harbour station. Some construction work was required at either end to allow the narrow gauge trains access to the tunnel. The new electric line terminated near Dumpton Park Station on the loop built by the Southern to replace the harbour branch. To gain access to the tunnel at the northern end of the line, trains had to negotiate a gradient of 1 in 15. The line was single track with a passing loop in the middle. Lack of space for locomotives to run round at either end made it essential to use multiple unit stock. All the electrical equipment was supplied by English Electric. Initially, 4-car trains were used, but by the time these films were made in the early 1960s, 2 trailers sufficed for the traffic on offer. Power was collected via an overhead wire. The railway operated on 400 volts AC. The only signalling was at the passing loop, which had spring-operated points. As might be expected, for a line operating mostly in a tunnel, the trains had duplicate lighting systems and a battery as a backup in case the power supply failed altogether. Unlike the line at Ramsgate, our next seaside railway is still very much in business. This is the view from the pier at Hythe on Southampton Water. Ferryboats ply from Southampton over to Hythe, a journey which can still be made more conveniently and quickly on water than by land. The third rail electric line carries passengers along the length of the pier out to join the ferryboats, which tie up at the deep water moorings at the extremity of the pier. The landward end is right in the centre of Hythe. Buses also feed passengers onto the railway and the boats. Thus, rather than being merely a pleasure line, the Hythe Pier Railway plays a valuable role in the transport infrastructure of the greater Southampton area. The train in use today is the same as that seen here in this footage made in the early 1960s, though its livery has been changed to red and white. These brief scenes were filmed at the other Hythe, the one in Kent, and out on the marsh on the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway in the early 1930s, not long after the line had been opened in July 1927. Built by Captain J.E.P. Howie, it runs along a desolate stretch of the Kent coast, from Hythe near Folkestone, through Dymchurch and New Romney to Dungeness. Construction was authorised by a light railway order issued under the terms of the Light Railways Act of 1896. Despite its 15-inch gauge, the intention of Captain Howie and his engineer Henry Greenley was to create a full-scale railway in miniature. The 1/3 scale locomotives, designed by Greenley based on Gresley Specifics then in service on the London and North Eastern Railway, being evidence of this. The line was nearly 14 miles long and as built had double track throughout, though the section from New Romney to Dungeness was singled after World War II. The locomotives were capable of hauling substantial loads at speeds of up to 25 miles per hour. The halt at St Mary's Bay was 6 miles from Hythe. The locomotive on the train approaching the station is number 5, Hercules, a 482 two-cylinder machine built in 1927 by Davy Paxman. Hercules actually hauled the official opening train in that year. The only other 8-couple locomotives to run on the narrow gauge in the British Isles were a pair of 480 tender engines used on the Londonderry and Lough Swilly Railway in the northwest of Ireland, one of which is featured on Volume 3 of our Irish Railways video series. Going on 70 years after it was opened, the RHDR is still in business, carrying visitors through Romney Marsh, a unique line in an interesting setting, showing just what can be achieved on the narrowest gauge practical for public service. The final railway in this collection of narrow gauge lines from up and down the length of Britain has the distinction of being the first railway in the country to have been powered by electricity. The 2-foot 8.5-inch gauge Vokes Electric Railway along the seashore of Brighton opened on the 4th of August 1883, beating by a few weeks the much longer Giant's Causeway tramway in Ulster. The line, the brainchild of Magnus Voke, who was born in Brighton in 1851 of German parentage, runs from the aquarium near the Palace Pier to where the marina is now situated at Black Rock. There is an intermediate stopping place at Halfway, or Paston Place, where there is a children's playground, which boasted another type of narrow gauge train, though this one is outside the scope of this programme. The car sheds were also located here. The running lines pass through the sheds, which can be closed off with temporary portable doors to provide additional covered accommodation when the railway is not running.